primarily, primarily the southern 2/3 of the coast is my territory or jurisdiction. I'm trying to advance the slide. And I share the coast with colleagues who handle the North Coast. So anywhere from Tillamook north, so Garibaldi, Rockaway Beach, up through Long Beach of Washington is actually handled by a separate entity. The Seaside Aquarium and Portland State University have authorization to respond to strandings. That's separate from mine, but we do work very well together. We've been longtime colleagues. And my area is the area in the orange, basically from Tillamook down to Brookings. So there is a lot of activity with stranding response that goes on through that part of the state. And we have specific authorization through NOAA Fisheries that gives us this permission basically to respond to marine mammal strandings. As you probably know, marine mammals are all protected by federal law. They're all covered under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And any interference with the goings on of marine mammals, even if they're dead, would be in violation of that law if not under proper authority. The objectives of the Stranding Network are primarily to advance science, to understand better the health issues that marine mammals face, and by investigating causes of mortality, looking at diseases, and also human causes of mortality, to get a better sense of what the threats are to populations of marine mammals. We also work as best as we can with limited resources to provide for the welfare of live animals. And that mostly involves mitigating harassment. So trying to prevent people and their dogs from interfering with animals that are in many cases just coming ashore to go through normal biologic functions. Seals and sea lions have to come ashore to get rest on a regular basis. And people come to the beach to get recreation. So sometimes those are in conflict, and folks who help us in the Stranding Network are key players in helping to mitigate those negative impacts that people can have on marine mammals when they come ashore. We also have the means to disentangle marine mammals. In some cases, it's often difficult to respond to every case, but we are equipped to respond to entanglements of whales and live seals and sea lions as well. A lot of what I do is working directly with members of the general public and advancing education about what marine mammals are and the fact that they actually share the shore with us, and our behaviors can have impacts on those animals. And we receive about 1,000 calls a year from members of the public that report animals that are ashore. So it's a busy endeavor, handling a stranding hotline basically 7 days a week. Ultimately, my responsibilities are to report any strandings that I'm made aware of to a NOAA Fisheries national database. And that database compiles strandings information from all around the country. And it helps inform those who make regulations and manage the stocks of marine mammals to better understand what the issues are that are facing them. So stranding response all plays into a much bigger picture nationwide about marine mammal health. I thought I'd mention, in Oregon, we have a somewhat unique policy regarding rehabilitation. Just about every other state that I'm aware of has a policy that would involve bringing live animals into a captive setting, a hospital setting, and providing rehabilitation. In fact, I spent about 10 years doing that sort of work at the New England Aquarium in Boston, where harbor seal pups would be brought in and cared for and then fattened up and released back into the wild. In Oregon, there's a pretty strict policy that prohibits that sort of activity. And the reasons for that are varied. I'm not going to get into them right now, but to put it simple, we are prohibited of bringing animals into rehabilitation for the most part. We also don't have facilities to do it. They're extremely expensive. Providing rehabilitation for a single marine mammal could spend upwards of tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on the case. So it's not something that we really have the means or the ability to do in the vast majority of cases. However, there are some exceptions. For instance, if we're dealing with an animal that's listed on the Endangered Species Act, and there are a few seals, fur seals in particular, that would qualify under that. And sometimes cases involving human interactions. So if we have an animal that's been entangled or gunshot, or maybe a dog attacked a seal pup and was injured that way, it could potentially end up in rehabilitation. And one exception to this policy, I'll mention because it happened right here in Oceanside last June. And Kim, who's here in the room with us, was instrumental in the response to this animal. This was a newborn Steller sea lion who likely had been just born hours before it showed up on the beach on the offshore rocks just off of Oceanside. And this animal came up on a very busy beach in June with lots of people drawn to it. It was obviously a very curious animal, and it was following people on the beach. It was basically vocal and active, and letting nature take its course was not going to be a satisfactory response for anybody. The mother was not going to come ashore in this situation. Steller sea lions are not known to come onto busy beaches where people are, and she likely had no idea that the pup had ventured onto a beach. They generally stay offshore on rocks to haul out. They don't come onto busy beaches. So this animal was sort of a unique situation. And incidentally, Steller sea lions have recently been delisted from the Endangered Species Act. They were a threatened species until 2013. And NOAA Fisheries is still very interested in seeing how they are recovering from that period of time where they had been a threatened species. So there is still, even though it's not currently a listed species, there was interest in rehabilitating it. And we do have partners outside of Oregon who have the means to do rehabilitation. So this animal basically involved a multi-state effort. We had a veterinarian come down from Seattle, and she came down in her ambulance, which is a very nicely tricked out Mercedes Sprinter van. And she came down, she got on the beach. We did a health assessment together. We got the animal into the, her ambulance. She gave it subcutaneous fluids and stabilized it and got it on the road. And she held it overnight in Seattle. And then that next morning, she turned around and she drove to Sausalito, California, where the animal spent the next 10 or 11 months in rehabilitation at the Marine Mammal Center, which is the premier rehabilitation center for marine mammals in the world. And that animal received top-notch medical care in the company of another Steller sea lion pup that had also been rescued, not in Oregon, but down in California. But rehabilitating Steller sea lions can be very tricky because they tend to imprint on people, and it's very important that they learn how to forage properly. They learn how to catch fish, and generally they spend a year with their mothers before they're weaned, learning that whole process. So trying to teach a sea lion in captivity how to hunt fish and not be imprinted on people and drawn to people and seeking people for their own sustenance is a challenge. And it turns out this animal was just released a little over a week ago off Crescent City, California, with another Steller sea lion by its side, both a male and female. And they, I don't know if you can see it on the left slide, left picture, you can see some satellite tags that have been glued to their fur. And these are little computers basically that send location information to satellites, which can then send the information back to the folks at the Marine Mammal Center, and they can keep track of the animal's whereabouts. So we're going to be very eagerly observing their movements and hoping and expecting that they will do well living in the wild. They are released basically in a place that's very close to a very well-known haul out for Steller sea lions off the Crescent City coast. So they're in good company. And we also know that the foraging conditions down there are quite good right now for the sea lions. So fingers crossed, it'll work out well. But again, I have to mention that this is an exception to the general rule. We cannot expect to be able to do this. Well, we'll have to take each case as it comes, but it wasn't an easy sell with the powers that be to make this happen. So if this is successful, if these animals thrive after release, that would certainly be a wonderful thing for them and for the potential for doing it again. Yes.
Do you know how much approximately money went into this?
I don't. I would guess probably in the tens of thousands of dollars per animal. Yeah, given the length of the time that they were in care. They didn't require anything terribly invasive like surgery or anything that would have driven up the costs, or maybe even, you know, diagnostics that would have involved MRIs or CTs or anything like that. I'm guessing. I don't think they had anything that was medically wrong with them. They were just orphaned basically, and they needed to be brought up, you know, as neonates to the point where they could survive on their own. So it's mostly staff time, facility time. But yeah, it's costly. Fortunately, the Marine Mammal Center was well equipped to provide all of that. It's not something you can just build out of nothing quickly. So lacking the means to rehabilitate animals, a lot of what I do is collecting of what we call level A data. And these are basic bits of information that we can gather from any animal that comes ashore. And these are things that volunteers can be instrumental in helping us collect. And these basically include identifying the species and the location of where the animal came ashore, the age of the animal approximately. We can basically guess that by its body length, the sex of the animal, the status of the animal, whether it's live or dead, or if it is dead, whether it's freshly dead or has been decomposing. Any description of signs of possible human interaction, if it had maybe been involved in fisheries, maybe there's some netting that's entangling the animal, perhaps it's been shot by somebody. In some cases, animals are struck by boats, and there's propeller wounds. And if there's any tags or brands on the animal, those are very important to the agencies that apply those to the animals. A lot of seals and sea lions are branded or tagged by either the Department of Fish and Wildlife in Oregon or in Washington, or the National Marine Fisheries Service. And resites of those tags are very useful in them understanding the dynamics of these populations, where the animals go, where they forage, and what fisheries they might be interacting with. To give you a sense of the types of strandings that we get and the numbers that we see, I've put together this graph showing strandings between 2006 and 2021. And you can see the red bars are the pinnipeds, the blue bars are the cetaceans. The vast majority of what we see are pinnipeds. So seals and sea lions by far are the most common marine mammals strandings that we get. We've also had a few sea otters, which are in the little green bars, and I'll mention sea otters a little bit later. I also have a category here I call sightings. Now, these are not just animals that are maybe sighted by naturalists, you know, watching an animal swimming by offshore, but these are animals that are reported as strandings. These are animals that are actually on the beach, and we have documentation of them. And in some cases, they might not be in perfect health, but they generally were able to get back into the water and go off, and they did not satisfy the criteria that NOAA Fisheries sets out about what a stranded animal is. But they still involve a response of some level. And in some cases, it may have been multi-days that the animal was on the beach, and it may have involved lots of volunteer activity to respond.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Is there anything significant ocean condition-wise, 2009?
That's yes, I will repeat the question. The question was there anything significant happening in the oceans during 2009 and 2010? And that's a great observation. Yes, there was. There was an El Nino situation going on. And El Nino, by the way, is when the ocean waters are warmer than the norm. And that will cause all sorts of changes with the California current system, basically the regime of productivity that occurs offshore. So lots of changes happen in the food that these animals eat, basically, and where they go to get their food. That was a year when we had a huge influx of sea lions into Oregon waters. And we also had an outbreak of a disease called leptospirosis, which I'll talk about later too. So those numbers were driven largely by California sea lions that were in greater numbers than usual. There are many fewer sea lions, I understand, in California during that period. A lot of them had come further north, probably looking for food. And many of those that did come further north were sick with a contagious bacterial infection that took its toll on a large number of them. So thank you for the question. And looking at numbers overall between that same period, you can break it down. You can see, well, I can break it down a little further. The majority of the animals are California sea lions, as I mentioned, followed by harbor seals. So these are the two species we see the most of, and harbor seals you'll hear more about later, but we have a nice population of them right here in Netarts Bay. And on the cetacean side, which is the graph on the right, the harbor porpoise is by far the most abundant species that we see on strandings. And a lot of people aren't that familiar with harbor porpoises, despite the fact that they're so abundant. They are very small. They're not animals that you see much of unless you're familiar with them. Even if you're on the water, you may just see their little dorsal fin popping over the surface. But they are out there, and we will tend to see them, especially during the late spring, early summer months, which coincides with their calving season. So it's often newborn harbor porpoises that are prone to strandings, as well as the young of the previous year that are just reaching the point of weaning. The mother harbor porpoises give birth, and then they pretty much have to stop giving care to their last year's calf to focus on the new calf. So last year's calf has to learn very quickly how to make a living and to survive on its own. And that's a critical period in their development. So we tend to see strandings of younger harbor porpoises during that time of year. I created this slide just to demonstrate within this particular area, the types of strandings and frequency of strandings that we've had going back to 2015. And you can see, again, we have California sea lions and harbor porpoises and harbor seals comprising the majority of the cases that occur. There've also been a couple that don't fit into either the cetacean or pinniped categories. We had a sea otter as well as an olive sea turtle, and I'll mention sea turtles a little bit later as well. So there's quite a number of different types of marine mammals that come ashore in this area. It's a relatively busy spot. And I really depend on opportunistic sightings of these animals to be reported to me. So this is most likely an undercount of what actually has occurred during this period of time. The more people that become aware of reporting strandings, the more likely we are to receive more reports and have the means to respond more quickly. I've mentioned pinnipeds and seals and sea lions a bit already, and I just want to point out that there are differences between seals and sea lions that can help inform what we're seeing when we see an animal on the beach and what type of animal you're actually looking at. Basically, within the group of seals and sea lions, we have two primary families. On the top, we have what's known as a true seal or a phosid seal, and that includes harbor seals and elephant seals. And these animals are different in that they do not have the means to stand up on their flippers, and they lack an external ear flap. If you look at the side of their head, you'll see a hole, but you don't see an actual pinna like we have, like a dog or a cat has. There's just an opening. They also have much shorter front flippers, and they use their hind flippers to swim primarily. They move their hind flippers back and forth. And they're actually probably better adapted for spending more time in the water. They are better divers in some cases, and they're not as adept at moving on land. The other family is the Otariid group, and I would call them just the sea lions, but there's also a group of animals called fur seals that are part of that group too. And it's a little bit confusing if you try to differentiate seals and sea lions. Fur seals are actually part of the sea lion family group. So it is confusing. But Within that group, we have California and stellar sea lions, as well as 2 different species of fur seals, the Guadalupe fur seal and the northern fur seal. And these animals are able to walk on their front flippers. They can support their weight on their flippers, and they can rotate their hind flippers underneath their body. So they can actually move on all 4 limbs. And in some cases, they can move quite quickly on land. They can, if they're feeling defensive or territorial, they can even lunge after you. So you might want to provide a little additional care if you approach one of these on the beach. Not that I would recommend you approach any of them, frankly, but these animals you might want to be more weary of, especially if you have a dog with you, because they can become territorial and defensive. There are some things that folks often misunderstand about pinnipeds in general. First of all, if they see one on the beach and its fur is dried out, they might think, oh, the animal needs to get back into the water. It's going to dehydrate. It's going to die because it's out of the water. And that's simply not true. These animals are adapted for coming ashore. In some cases, they can spend weeks out of the water. There's actually an elephant seal that looks like this animal. This is a northern elephant seal, a juvenile. There's one right now in Newport, right next to the Hatfield Marine Science Center where I work. It's been there for 2 weeks, and it's going through an annual molting process. So it is out of the water intentionally. It's fasting, so it's not eating anything. It's metabolizing its stored fat, so it can basically burn calories out of its stored fat, and it can get all the water that it needs by burning the fat as well. And it goes through this process once a year because it needs to shed its fur and its skin. It's unfortunate for them, I would think, because it looks like a very uncomfortable situation. They look miserable when they're on the beach, and they are also susceptible to harassment by people and dogs that find them. But they don't need to be in the water. They really don't want to be in the water. They want to get away from the water as much as possible. This animal in particular at Hatfield, right now it's up in dune grass. It's away from the water as much as it can be without actually walking into a parking lot, which incidentally they sometimes do. So they intentionally get out of the water for various reasons. And they do need to get rest on land in many cases, although sometimes they can rest at sea. Those that come ashore to get rest are there because they have a need to get rest. And we really need to be able to respect that need and give them the time and space that they require. When they move on land, they move very awkwardly. They are not in what we might think of as having much of a sense of skill or
Grace and beauty.
Thank you. They do not move gracefully on land, especially the true seals, the faucet seals. They move on their bellies, basically. They move like a caterpillar, and they don't do it quickly. So if they're making their way to the water, they might well take a half hour or so to go 10 or 20 yards because they want to take their time. They don't want to overheat their bodies. They want to conserve energy. And they are generally quite mindful of the tide. So they might just be waiting for the tide to come up a little closer to make their job a little bit easier. That might be hastened if people are, stressing them out or making them feel like they need to get back into the water quickly. But generally, they don't move as gracefully as we might think they should. It doesn't mean they're incapable of it or that they're injured. It's just that's the way they're designed. They're designed to be in the water as well as on land. So there's a compromise in their body design. They can do one thing really well and they can do something else not quite as gracefully, perhaps. And they can go for long periods of time without eating. And this happens especially with elephant seals. It also happens with sea lions when they're going into their breeding seasons. They will often forego feeding for that other biological need that you might imagine. They will spend sometimes days or weeks without hunting for fish, but spending time in breeding colonies. The males will be fighting with each other to gain access to females in many cases. And generally, if you find a marine mammal on the beach, it really should be left alone, a pinniped in particular. They don't want us to be providing them with any kind of assistance. They don't want people pouring water on them. They don't want to be dragged back in the water. They don't want a tuna fish sandwich. They just want to be left alone, really. And any attention you give them when they're trying to rest is going to stress them out. And we all know stress does not make us feel any better. It can complicate any health issues that we're dealing with. So seals and sea lions come ashore as a natural course. It's part of their biology, and it's something that they need to do to stay healthy. So how do we determine when a marine mammal is actually stranded and not just resting on the beach? And that can be a subjective decision that we have to make. It's not always straightforward. We can't always just apply a litmus test and say, oh, that animal's fine or that animal's stranded. Sometimes it takes time. You might want to monitor the animal for a day or two and see what it decides to do after a few tide cycles. But one way to determine whether an animal is stranded is if it's dead. That is a litmus test right there. So, and some people think, well, I saw a dead animal, but it wasn't stranded, it was dead. It's like, well, actually it was stranded, and it is something that I definitely want to know about, and I want to be able to report and have a record of. So dead marine mammals are considered stranded. Live animals that cannot get back to the water for one reason or another, perhaps by an injury, or maybe there's some sort of physical obstruction that keeps them from getting back to the water. Sometimes they get disoriented, they get very far from the water and they don't know how to get back to where they had come. So sometimes they need some help doing that, and that would be considered a stranding. If they're critically ill or injured, that's certainly, and that makes up the majority of live animals that are considered stranded. In some cases, animals venture from their natural habitat. They may swim many hundreds or even thousands of miles from where they belong and where they can make a living and be with other members of their species. So in those cases, they would also be considered stranded. I mentioned elephant seals. This, again, is an elephant seal that came up in Newport last year, much like the one that's at the Hatfield Marine Science Center right now. And this is at South Beach Jetty in Newport. And this animal spent about a week on the beach, again, going through that annual molting process where they're shedding their fur and their skin. This animal came up right in a very busy walkway adjacent to the South Jetty. So it was encountered by numerous people over the time that it was there. So much so that a reporter from the News Times in Newport called me up and wanted some information about the seal. He wanted to do a feature story on it. And as much as I wanted to give him some good information about it and advise people to leave it alone, I was very concerned that having a front page above the fold story about a seal that's accessible on the beach in Newport was not going to be in its best interest. And the writer assured me he would be respectful, he would give factual information, and he would advise people not to go near the seal. So I begrudgingly gave him an interview and sort of was crossing my fingers that it wasn't going to create a big spectacle on the beach. Unfortunately, the morning that this article ran in the paper, the seal had decided it was time to go back into the water and took off. So I was so relieved that the timing worked out as well as it did. This animal was perfectly healthy, but it was lying in a state that made it look like it was quite sick, and to many people it looked like it was dying. So just something to be aware of. Elephant seals will often give you the impression that they're in bad shape when they're really just fine. So generally speaking, if we see a pinniped on the beach, we want to try to keep the area quiet. We want to minimize stress. Again, that's really the big thing. Stress will impede their immune system if they are fighting any kind of an infection. And elephant seals going through the molt are already under a lot of stress already. So that would just be compounding it by trying to get into it and having it to constantly lift its head up and watch out for potential threats. Like on the left side, we have an elephant seal that's being approached by a very nice looking Labrador retriever. But the elephant seal doesn't necessarily realize that that dog doesn't mean no harm. And he is likely to expend a lot of energy just feeling defensive. Likewise, we don't want to be offering it any food or trying to pour water on it. Those things are only going to stress it out. If it's ashore, chances are it's not looking for food anyway. It is there for other reasons, primarily just to get some rest. Now, as opposed to pinnipeds, cetaceans, which are the whales and dolphins and porpoises, they are not in any way adapted for coming ashore. They do not belong on land. And if they come ashore, it is a clear indication that they are stranded. And unfortunately, they are not likely to survive once they come ashore unless they can be very quickly brought back into the water. In most cases, a cetacean that does come ashore is already compromised. That is the reason why they came ashore in the first place. So even if we had the means and the time, we had people available to get an animal back into the water, it wouldn't necessarily save its life long-term, because whatever health issue drove it ashore in the first place would still be happening post-release. And you hear a lot of stories in the media about animals, whales and dolphins that are rescued and put back in the water and they swim off and disappear, and people feel good about that. But it doesn't necessarily mean the animal was helped in the long run. In most cases, it seems that a lot of those animals are not likely to survive. And we know this because we are able to necropsy animals that do die on the beach, and they often have very severe pre-existing conditions. Now, mass strandings are one exception to this. There are places in the world where large numbers of dolphins and whales will come ashore at one time. And in many cases, these are otherwise healthy animals that have made a poor decision and they've come into a place that they're just not able to get themselves out of. I experienced that myself working at the New England Aquarium in Boston. We responded to dolphin and pilot whale strandings on Cape Cod multiple times a year. And in many cases, these were healthy animals that just found themselves in an estuary at low tide, and they just could not get themselves out of there quickly enough. And unfortunately, once they come ashore, a cascading of very severe health issues begins happening. So there's a very short time window when even a healthy cetacean can be refloated and rescued, as it were. And there's no need to figure out all the aspects of this flow chart. I just wanted to point out the complexity of what happens physiologically when a cetacean comes ashore. They basically shunt blood from critical parts of their body, depriving it of oxygen. So body tissues basically start to die within a relatively short period of time. And some of these effects are irreversible. So even if you were able to get the animal back into the water swimming, if it's been out of the water for hours, it may not be able to recover even if it was healthy before it came ashore. The harbor porpoise I mentioned, this is the most commonly stranded cetacean we have. It's also the smallest cetacean that we have, and it probably is more resilient to stranding effects than larger animals are. It's also a coastal animal, so it's basically still in its normal environment if it comes ashore, as opposed to other species of whales and dolphins, which often come from deep water and are not familiar with swimming in coastal waters. So in some cases, harbor porpoises can be refloated successfully and put back into the water, and they can survive. So this is an animal that could potentially be rescued and put back into the water if it's found to be in good health at the time of its stranding. I get a lot of reports from people who see healthy whales close to shore that believe that they are in the process of stranding, when in fact they are just earning a living. Here's a video of a gray whale that's foraging close to shore off Salishan, just south of Lincoln City. And this whale is basically right along the surf zone. You could almost reach out and touch it. And the people that reported this animal were convinced the whale was stuck and it was about to die if it wasn't rescued. This animal is actually just gorging on dense patches of prey, small invertebrates in the water column. And this is completely normal behavior, and it happens mostly in the summer months. And I get a lot of reports about it, often further south than we are here, but it is a potential thing that you may encounter a whale close to shore that may appear to be in distress when in fact it's just earning a living. Now, having come from the East Coast where we don't have gray whales, this was not something that I was familiar with. And when I first got reports about a gray whale this close to shore, I assumed, like many people, that yes, this animal's in distress. It's likely to strand. It's an emergency situation, more or less. But gray whales are unique in their foraging strategy, and they are risk takers, I would say, too, coming right up into the surf zone to get food. It isn't without risks. We have on occasion had some that have gotten too close to shore and have stranded, but by and large, it's a normal process that they do successfully. So a lot of the work I do is to better understand the health of these animals, and that's often through a necropsy, which is basically an autopsy that's conducted on a non-human animal. And I work closely with the diagnostic lab at the Oregon State University Veterinary College of Medicine. And they help us to determine the cause of death on a lot of the cases that we work on. And there are some common findings that we see over time. First of all, with California sea lions, we tend to see a disease called leptospirosis, which is a kidney infection caused by a bacterium that they can pass to each other, usually through their urine. If you've been to Newport, to the docks at the bayfront, you've probably seen sea lions that like to pile on top of each other on the docks. Well, they also end up relieving themselves on each other too. And it's one way that they can spread this leptospirosis to each other. And we tend to see outbreaks of this disease, especially during the fall and early winter months. And some years are worse than others. So every August and September, I'm crossing my fingers, hoping it's not going to be a bad year for leptospirosis, because as you noticed in the 2009, 2010 years, we had a huge outbreak of leptospirosis, and it affected a lot of California sea lions. Not all of them died, but a lot of them were in really bad shape. We do know that sometimes they can survive this. We have been able to test animals for their titers. The Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife has actually collected blood samples from live California sea lions, and they have found lots of them that have positive titers in their blood. So they've had active infections that they've successfully been able to fend off and to survive. But we do know that it can have a very devastating effect on them as well. And they will often seek out fresh water because they become dehydrated. So you will sometimes find the California sea lion in a creek along the beach, drinking water. Marine mammals generally don't drink water unless they're severely dehydrated. They can get all the water that they need from the food that they eat by metabolizing it. Other disease processes that we often see are things that affect the neurologic systems of both seals and dolphins. With harbor seals, we see a protozoal parasite that affects their brains. And this often happens during the month of May. So we may actually see some of that in the next few weeks. And that this disease unfortunately renders the animals unable to function properly. They often come ashore and start convulsing on the beach. And likewise with dolphins, we see a disease called neurobrucellosis, which is again caused by a bacterium, which is contagious. And it's something that tends to be common in striped dolphins in particular. Striped dolphins are a species that are usually found in warmer waters offshore. They're not necessarily associated with the Oregon coast per se, but we have seen increasing numbers of these animals stranding over the last decade or so in Oregon. And also pneumonia is probably the primary disease process that we see across the board in all different types of marine mammals. Respiratory infections are very common and lead to the animals becoming weak and leading to them to become malnourished. And we also see trauma, often caused by predators like sharks. I'm seeing this more and more actually, and it's letting me to understand better that there are a lot of sharks out there in the ocean, and they do prey upon seals and sea lions. Now, when I find a marine mammal on the beach, or if a volunteer does, the basic sets of information that we want to gather are basically things that we can do with a smartphone or even just a pen and paper, noting the location of the animal, the type of animal, taking pictures of the animal from multiple angles, enable us to get a sense of the animal's body condition, any signs of trauma that might be obvious. And basically, any notes here, you can see that the eyes for this stellar sea lion had been scavenged by birds. That's completely normal. Birds will make use of these animals as food, sometimes while they're still alive, unfortunately. And in many cases, we will remove an animal like this from the beach or actually do a necropsy on the beach and determine as best as we can about its health. And here we can see that this animal died of salmonella infection. Basically, it had an infection in its abdomen that then spread to its lungs and affected multiple organs in the body. And this is a fairly normal type of disease process that we see. Over the last few years, we've also seen a number of elephant seal pups that have shown up in states of poor nutrition. It seems that elephant seals have rebounded quite a bit in the last few decades. Their numbers are increasing, and they seem to be expanding further beyond the Central California coast, where most of them are born. In fact, we've had several born in the Oregon coast over the last couple summers, the last couple seasons. They are born in January generally, but they will start showing up in this emaciated state after they have spent a few months post-weaning, trying to find out how to make a living. And in some cases, they're just not able to find enough to eat. It's a tricky business out there for them. And you can see on the graph on the bottom right that the summer months are when we typically see a lot of the elephant seals coming ashore. So this is one species that you may be seeing. This is separate from the molting process, by the way. I mentioned molting earlier. Molting happens once a year throughout the entire lifespan of an elephant seal. These are animals that are just a few months old, so they're somewhat smaller. They're not shedding their fur and their skin. They're simply having a hard time making ends meet. And likewise, we have been seeing fur seals that are succumbing to malnutrition. And this is something that's been increasing over the last few years. And we have two different species of fur seals, as I mentioned. On the left is the Guadalupe fur seal. It tends to be a dark chocolate brown in color. It has a longer snout on it than the fur seal on the right, which is the northern fur seal, which tends to be more of a charcoal gray with a pale or whitish belly. But both of these species are typically found offshore. They don't come ashore to get rest the way the coastal seals and sea lions that we have here are. So if you see a fur seal on the beach, we can fairly surmise that there's something that's compromised the animal. He's or she is probably not finding a lot to eat or is somehow disoriented, is far from its normal range. They're usually in deeper water offshore. And we have been seeing increasing numbers of Guadalupe fur seals in particular, and NOAA Fisheries several years ago declared what's called an unusual mortality event for the species. And this is basically something that becomes activated in the event that larger numbers of these animals are stranding than would be predicted. And it's often because of a phenomenon that cannot easily be explained. So we might be seeing large numbers of animals dying, but without any immediate cause that can be identified. So that usually triggers an investigation, and it becomes a process where we work collaboratively with other stranding response folks along the entire range of where these strandings are happening. And we step up our response levels and try to better understand what the drivers might be. Over the course of time that we've been investigating this UME, basically we haven't found any disease processes or anything out of the ordinary that would explain in individual animals what is happening, but we have been seeing malnourished animals basically. And we've also been monitoring what are known as marine heat waves, so higher than normal water temperatures, which makes it harder for these animals to find enough food to eat, or perhaps having to go to places where they wouldn't ordinarily go to get the food that they eat. So there have been changes, again, in the California current system that these animals depend upon, which have effects on their ability to survive. So we'll be watching these animals carefully in the years to come. This UME was officially closed last September, basically because it was determined that there was not an infectious disease process or something else that was novel that was perhaps driving this situation. But in fact, it was more of a broad scale environmental change that the animals are going to have to respond to. We've also been dealing with the unusual mortality event with gray whales over the last 4 years. And this has involved gray whales basically from Mexico all the way to Alaska. There have been higher than normal mortalities involving the species. I should say Oregon has not experienced higher than normal levels specifically, but system-wide, we have seen much higher numbers in Mexico, California, Washington, and Alaska. I don't know why Oregon has been spared of these higher numbers, but I am certainly feeling fortunate about that. And it does seem too that the UME has been slowing down. So we are not seeing the level of mortality that we did see back in 2019, which was the most severe year of this situation. And it seems like we are on track to have a more normal year, I think, up and down the West Coast. But time will tell. We're still early in the season. A lot of these gray whales will succumb to strandings during the spring migration, which we are in right now. Gray whales do most of their foraging or feeding during the summer months in the high Arctic regions of the Chukchi and Arctic Oceans. And then they migrate south to Baja California, Mexico to give birth. And they do not eat at all during that period of time between when they're foraging in the summer and when they're breeding in the winter. And then they have to return back up to the foraging grounds. So they have fasted for many months by the time they're returning. So they are nutritionally compromised, especially if it's a female that's been lactating all that time, and now she's transferring her nutrients to her calf. It's a very stressful time for them, and it will lead them to become more susceptible to malnutrition during the northward migration. So fingers crossed, we are in the midst of their northward migration right now. And as things stand right now, it does not appear to be an abnormally high year. So hopefully this UME will have past us before long. Whoops. I just mentioned that this is a paper that came out a year or two ago that describes poor body condition in the whales as being a likely cause for the UME. The foraging conditions in the Arctic have changed quite a bit, and it may be that the gray whales are having to adjust to different foraging conditions, learning to feed upon different prey items, or finding prey in locations other than where they had historically been feeding. I mentioned leptospirosis. I just thought I'd mention it briefly again. This is one disease that we want to pay particular attention to if we take our dogs with us on the beach. Leptospirosis is something that can affect dogs. There are vaccines that you can get for a dog to protect it from leptospirosis, but this is an infection that is serious and is something to be aware of, especially if you're on the beach with a pet. And also underscores the need to give marine mammals wide berth and not let your pet interact with them in any way. Human interactions are another category of mortality and morbidity that we see in marine mammals. Unfortunately, we have been seeing fewer instances of human interactions over the last several years than we did maybe 10 years ago or less. And in many cases, these are driven by activities that are occurring further north than here. These numbers are drawn from the entire network that we have between Oregon and Southern Washington. And a lot of gunshot cases and fishery interactions happen in the mouth of the Columbia River. And looking by species, California sea lions are by far the most impacted by these human interactions. And again, you can see on the right-hand graph that the North Coast bears the brunt of a lot of these human interactions. This picture of this entangled fur seal, incidentally, I included it here specifically for this talk because that animal came up at Bay Ocean Spit 2 years ago. and was rescued by a ranger from Cape Lookout State Park. I actually got the call about the animal. I was on my way up to treat it myself. I got as far as Nescoin when he called me on the phone and said he had just successfully cut the net off the animal and it swam back into the water. So it was a happy ending. I was very happy to hear about. Unfortunately, fur seals do get wrapped up into trawl nets periodically. These are often nets that have been discarded at sea, and the seals will inadvertently swim into them and end up getting stuck. But this animal's lucky that it came ashore in a place where it could be rescued. We had a fur seal as well several years ago down in Winchester Bay that came ashore and was brought to the Oregon Coast Aquarium. And I worked with them to remove this material. This was a very light twine that resembled the cord that you would see on a balloon. So although a balloon wasn't attached to this, I am fairly sure that this was probably the remains of the balloon that was released perhaps and it drifted off into the water and got wrapped around this northern fur seal's neck. This was a case where the animal was brought in for a very short-term rehab. It was cleaned up, given some subcutaneous fluids and some antibiotics. And then we brought it to Uquina Head, just north of Newport, and we were able to release it. And it's got a little flipper tag on its left front flipper. And that was so we could identify it if it were to restrand. And it never did, at least that we ever heard about. So that's another nice happy ending.
They stay on?
Yes, the tags will stay on generally for several years. They will eventually wear through, but yeah. And you obviously need to be able to recite the animal for the tag to have any value. Whereas a satellite tag, you don't necessarily need to have visual sight of the animal to receive information about its location. Although satellite tags only remain on while the fur remains on the animal, and most of these animals will shed their fur at least once a year. So, and satellite tag batteries wear out, so they generally will only last for a few months anyway. So, and generally animals that are satellite tagged are also flipper tagged. So you have two means of identifying the animal post-release. We do get a fair number of calls about entangled whales every year. Fortunately, most of the reports we get are not actual entanglements. It's usually a mistaken case where somebody sights a whale that's close to shore and there are crab buoys close to where the whale is. I mentioned gray whales forage close to shore. They focus on dense patches of prey. They can spend 5 or 6 or 7 hours at a time in a very small area foraging, maybe an area the size of this room, and they will continuously surface and dive and surface and dive in that same place. And it often happens right in front of vacation homes where people are visiting the coast. They're not necessarily familiar with gray whales, and they see this whale that's been in the same place for hours at a time, and there's crab buoys nearby. And they assume that the whale's entangled because it must be trapped, must be stuck on the crab buoy or crab pot. So those are false alarms that we get all too often. But there are also cases where gray whales and humpback whales and other species are impacted by fisheries, and they do get entangled primarily in Dungeness crab gear. We get about 3 confirmed reports of entangled whales each year. Most of these reports come to us from people that are out fishing and they are not necessarily able to stay with the whale, and they can give us the best information they have available, but generally they have to move on, and we don't generally have good real-time information about the location of these whales. But we do want to act upon any reports we get about stranded whales. And we do have a hotline number here, and I'll share that again later. It is important to report a stranded whale as quickly as possible so we can try to get some assets out there to document it and potentially get a team out to try to disentangle it. All disentanglements are overseen by NOAA Fisheries, and it's a very, it's a dangerous proposition. People have died trying to disentangle whales, and there are very strict limits on what we can do and when we can deploy gear, when we can get ourselves out there. And it often depends on the sea state. If it's blowing 30 knots and there's 10-foot swell, we're not going to be able to respond. And unfortunately, those are the conditions that we sometimes get on the Oregon coast. But sometimes we can get the Coast Guard out there to respond, at least to document the animal and to tell us its location, its direction, and we can then try to assemble a team perhaps later that day or the following day and see if we can get the gear off the whale. I also
Hey,
get
Jim.
calls about animals that are thought to be entangled, but they're actually doing a normal thing. Like the gray whales foraging close to shore, we get sea lions that show up floating in huge numbers. And this happens off Oceanside. Every summer I get reports that there are, a bunch of dead sea lions that are floating in a net right offshore. And I often spend a while talking to people and getting some more information on what they're seeing. But generally speaking, what they're reporting is a phenomenon called rafting. So this is one way sea lions can rest while they're at sea without having to come ashore. And they will just float in these large congregations, usually with one or two flippers sticking out of the water. And they look, for all intents and purposes, like they're dead. But please believe me, these are healthy animals that are just resting, and there's no need to be alarmed. There's nothing that needs to be done to rescue them. This is just a normal thing that they do. I briefly mentioned sea otters earlier. If I was given this talk 10 or 15 years ago, I wouldn't even mention sea otters because I would have assumed that there were no sea otters in Oregon. That's what I was told when I moved here, that they had been hunted virtually to extinction back in the early 20th century. It turns out we do see sea otters on occasion here, and we've actually documented quite a number of strandings and sightings of live animals going back to 2007. And this is an exciting prospect because sea otters are an important part of the marine ecosystem. They are a keystone species. They help maintain kelp forests, and their potential return to the Oregon coast would be a huge benefit to all sorts of aspects of marine life, as well as to people that would enjoy seeing them, and even to the fishing community itself. Although there is some debate within the fishing community as to whether they would be beneficial. Some folks who fish crab, for instance, would see them as a competitor. But by and large, the otters would be providing more stable kelp forest habitat, which would benefit any number of other fish and organisms that benefit by kelp forests. In any event, we are seeing more and more of these animals as time goes on, and they are thought to be making their way south from the Washington coast. There's a population of sea otters that's been growing off the Washington coast since they were reintroduced there back in the 1970s. Their founder stock was actually from the coast of Alaska, but a number of those animals were brought to the Washington coast in the early 70s, and they are growing by, I think, 12% a year now. So they are moving, getting bigger, and they're making their way further and further south. We are tending to see adult males that are venturing into the Oregon waters and finding places to forage, and hopefully they'll be coming back with some adult females and setting up some colonies at some point. There are also efforts to reintroduce the species. There's a nonprofit group called the Alaka Alliance that is very actively working to have a reintroduction program of sea otters to the Oregon coast. So if you're interested in sea otters, I would recommend you look into the Alaka Alliance and see how they're doing.
Hey, Jim?
Yes.
Can we take a pause for a minute and ask a couple of questions on the chat from the people on the Zoom?
Yes, the question is to pause for a moment and answer some questions from the chat on Zoom. So yes.
So I'll bring them up and we can just read them so everybody can know.
Okay. Okay, the first question: are there specific behaviors that would indicate an entanglement versus a feeding gray whale? Good question. I wouldn't necessarily say a behavior unless you're thinking about some active thrashing at the water surface, but that wouldn't necessarily mean that the animal's entangled. But what would indicate an entanglement would be obviously seeing gear attached to the whale. So if we saw anything wrapped around its body, its midsection, its head, its tail flukes, that would obviously indicate an entanglement. Also, if the whale is moving and there's gear that's moving alongside with the whale, or if the whale is diving and the gear is diving with the whale as well, those would lend credence to believing that the whale is entangled. But behavior in and of itself, without having gear directly associated with that behavior, I don't think would necessarily indicate an entanglement. And the other question is, what theories are there about why gray whales don't eat during migration? It would seem that the net energy expenditure for a baleen whale would not be so great as to preclude this. Well, that's a very good question. Baleen whales tend to have specific parts of the world where they forage, which are highly productive areas. And they tend to be in higher latitude parts of the oceans. And the breeding areas tend to be in the lower latitude, warmer water areas, which are not productive. They don't have basically the food resources that the baleen whales depend upon. So by and large, baleen whales depend on the high productivity of the Arctic or polar regions, whereas they depend on the warmer waters to help support the breeding. Actually, when a whale calf is born, it does much better in a warmer water environment than it would in a cold environment. So I guess that would be my answer to your question. There is one exception with gray whale that I might point out, is that there is a population of gray whales that don't actually migrate all the way up to the high latitudes, up to the Arctic, but they actually remain within our waters during the foraging season. And these whales are known as the Pacific Coast group of the gray whales. And they will range from Northern California to British Columbia, and they will forage on food that are locally available. So they will, in turn, do some foraging. They don't go all the way up to the north. They actually remain here during the non-breeding season. And some of the whales that migrate north do make some pit stops, I should point out as well. There's a group of whales that are well known for going into Puget Sound during their migration. And they're known as the Sounders, actually, by some whale biologists up in that area. And the Sounders are very well known for identifying specific areas within Puget Sound where they can forage on things like ghost shrimp. And they've developed specialized foraging techniques for digging into the mud and digging out those ghost shrimp. But those are sort of exceptions to the general rule. And these are whales that have developed this alternative foraging technique separate from the larger population, as it were. And there's some evidence that this foraging in the estuaries of, say, Puget Sound is a learned thing, so they can pass this information on to their offspring and to perhaps other whales that they associate with, but it's not something that's well understood within the population as a whole. So by and large, whales depend on the highly productive polar areas for foraging, just because that's where the resources for food exist. They would not be able to find sufficient forage if they all decided not to go up there. The population would not survive if that were the case. So I hope that answers your questions. Moving on to this slide, I thought I'd mention sea turtles. You'll probably understand sea turtles are not mammals, but they are protected species, and they are animals that we have concerns about. They are all either threatened or endangered species. And we have the means to be able to respond to them. The Oregon Coast Aquarium in Newport is equipped to respond to rehabilitate these animals. So if we find a sea turtle that's still alive, we do our best to rush it to the Oregon Coast Aquarium and give it critical care. And they've been successful in rehabilitating a number of turtles over the years. They can generally do short-term care. They can get the animal into a stable condition over the course of a week or so. And then the animal is generally transferred to a facility in Southern California, where it can go through the rest of its rehabilitation and then be eventually released into the ocean. And that's a very gratifying thing to be part of, to see that happen. And I will also do necropsies on sea turtles that don't survive so we can better understand the mechanisms that are involved in them coming up to the Pacific Northwest and to their succumbing on beaches here. They generally end up in water that they can't survive in. Is the bottom line. Most sea turtles are not adapted for cold water. They cannot really survive in water that's colder than 55 degrees. So we're not sure why they end up in the Pacific Northwest. It may be that they are just following currents that bring them up this far. And then when they get to the end of the current that carried warm water, they end up suddenly in a much colder environment that they're not able to survive in. Now, I wanted to finish up talking about harbor seals because this is a species that we have here in Echarts Bay. It's a species you're most likely to encounter. And I can describe some things that we can do to help minimize effects of strandings with harbor seals in particular. Have any of you encountered harbor seals on beaches here before? Yes. Were they live animals?
Subject, but it was again about 5 years ago, and it was a winter day. I didn't have my phone. There was really nobody else on the beach, and I almost tripped over a completely white pup, solid white.
Okay.
And I could see the mother out in the surf, and I backed off 100 feet and stood behind a rock and watched, and she never came back up. And I did some research on it. Sounds like that was a premature birth. Most
likely, and I'll get to that. Okay. Yes. So
you want to tell the story for the people on the room?
Yes.
Sorry.
If I can remember. So a member of the audience here did observe a harbor seal pup on a beach near Tunnel Beach in Oceanside. And it was a white pup that she saw on the beach, and she saw the mother offshore. The mother didn't come ashore while she was there, but she noticed that the pup was white and thought that that was perhaps a premature birth. And yes, I was going to get to that in a second. Well, anyway, I'll get to the premature birth in a second. This is what we want to avoid, though. We want to avoid the temptation to take a selfie with a seal pup. And this has been a growing problem, since the advent of social media and everyone wanting to capture a moment and share it with all their friends. This is really not good, though. It's not good for the pup. And it's not good to be spreading this message to other people in your circle that this is a cool thing to do. So anyway, what we want to do is try to reinforce the idea that seal pups are best left alone. And handling them is going to be stressful on them, and you're likely to be disrupting the mother from taking care of her pup. Most people take this information very well. They want to do what's best for animals. Most people care about animals and certainly don't want to intentionally hurt them. So getting a positive message out is important. Of course, telling people not to do something isn't necessarily a positive message to the person receiving that information, but we want to couch it in a positive way because we want it to be a positive outcome for the animal that's involved. Harbor seal pups are dependent on their mothers for about a month. And during that period of time, the pup needs the mother, and without the mother, it has no other means of survival. So there's a critical period of bonding that happens, especially in the first few days after birth. And if that bond is disrupted, the mother might very well abandon the pup, forego it, and no longer care for it. If the pup is no longer receiving maternal care, it will certainly not survive. So we want to provide people the information that they ought not to touch seal pups, and it's also against the law to do so. So that information sometimes has more sway with some people than others, but basically it's helpful to let people know that what they're doing would not be beneficial to the pup in any way. There's really nothing we can do for the pup by interacting with it on the beach. There are some developmental benchmarks we can look at when we see a newborn pup on the beach. So if it has that white fluffy coat that you mentioned, that's called lanugo. That's a coat of fur that actually exists in all harbor seal pups when they're still in the uterus, but it should be gone by the time the pup is born. In some cases, there are traces of lanugo left on a fully developed pup. But basically, if we see a white fluffy coat on a pup, it's probably been born too soon. And by too soon, that means that not all of its organs have fully developed yet, including a valve in the heart called the foramen ovale, which basically is a window between the two upper chambers of the heart, the atria. And if that window is still open, then the heart will not send enough blood to the lungs to allow it to get enough oxygen in its body once it comes out of the mother. So long story short, a white fluffy coat usually means the pup's heart hasn't fully developed. If the umbilicus is still attached, if it's still pink, that generally means that the animal's only been alive, been born for 24 to 48 hours. That pink umbilical cord will start to turn gray and then brown after about 2 days. And then it will basically dry up and shrivel off and fall off within about a week. So looking at these things, you can judge the relative age of the pup based on its umbilical cord and the remains of it on the pup. After about 3 or 4 weeks, the pup should have been nursing sufficiently and weigh in the neighborhood of 35 to 50 pounds. There is a fair amount of range depending. Some pups are born much bigger than others, and some are born just not able to eat as much or nurse as much. Sometimes the mothers aren't able to attend the pup as much because the beach isn't as quiet and she's not able to feel comfortable coming ashore often enough. We've had some cases where mothers are only able to nurse their pups at night when people aren't on the beach, and that's not an ideal situation at all. Anyway, here's a picture of what a lanugo pup looks like. Generally, they have a long coat of fur that is white in color. In the picture, well, I shouldn't walk away from the screen, I guess, but in the upper right picture, you can see the muzzle on the pup has dark spots on it. That's the way the entire coat of the pup should look. And the white fluffy fur of the lanugo should have been shed before the pup was born. This is what a normal newborn pup should look like. It has a pink umbilicus or umbilical cord, and it's not fluffy and white. You can see the pup on the upper left has sort of a whitish color to the fur, but it has the spotted coat, which is what you ideally want to see. The lanugo coat would basically cover up those spots so you would not see them. People will sometimes report to me that there's a seal with a severe injury on the beach. Fortunately, what they're generally talking about is just a fresh umbilical cord that's still attached. So it might look like the intestines of the animal are sticking out, but it's really just the umbilical cord. The pup on the top is a pup that has become emaciated and is dehydrated. So that's a pup that has not been nursed, and it's not likely to survive. The pup on the bottom has wet rings around the eyes, and that's a normal thing. The pups should have sufficient hydration that they can constantly be putting moisture out to keep their eyes wet. The eyes are healthy when they're wet. If the eyes are dry, it's generally a sign that the animal's dehydrated. This is what a female looks like just before giving birth. She is just huge. She can't wait to get that thing out of there, I'm sure. And this is a pup that had just been born. This photo was taken by Roy Lowe, who's a retired wildlife biologist in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and a wonderful photographer. And these pictures were taken down in Woldport several years ago. And you can see the birds are waiting, ready to feast on the placenta once it comes out. These pictures show what should happen when a mother and pup, when the pup is first born and starts nursing. Mother has a pair of teats on her abdomen. you can't see them too clearly unless you're up close. They stay pretty close to the surface of the skin. Sometimes you'll see a pup that can't find its mother and it will try nursing to anything it sees on the beach. It might be a piece of driftwood, or they might even try to nurse on you. I've had that happen to me several times where I'm walking by a pup and it will just run up to me and try to suckle to my leg. In those cases, it's best to just get away from the pup as quickly as possible. You don't want to be having the pup expending its precious energy, trying to nurse off something that's obviously not going to provide any nourishment. Here's the mother and pup greeting each other. They will touch noses. They will recognize each other's scents. They will recognize the mother will recognize the pup's individual call too. They have distinctive vocal sounds that they generate. So this is all very important at the very early stages of development of the pup after it's been born. It's developing that bond, the scent and the sound of the mother and the pup becoming familiar with each other. And then swimming together. So this is ideally what we want to see. Unfortunately, pups are sometimes born on a beach where there's people. The mother goes back into the water. Mothers are very shy. They don't want to be anywhere near people. And they are not going to try to defend their pups from potential threats. In order for this bonding to occur, we need to minimize the disturbance between us and the pups. And one of the best ways we have to do that is basically by giving people information and posting signs. I have some signs that I brought here. And one thing I want to point out is posting signs can in and of itself be stressful to the pup. And we don't want to be hammering away, making lots of noise, putting the sign into the sand. It's best to try to dig a hole and then put the sign into the hole and then tamp down the sand around the sign. If you don't have a shovel, sometimes I use the end of the post itself and just dig that way. Or if the sand is soft, you can use your hand. We sometimes use caution tape, which can be very helpful in keeping people away. The problem is caution tape is plastic and we don't want to create marine debris. And unfortunately, the tide will often wash a sign away if we're not attentive enough to move it as the tide is coming in. So I am a little bit leery of using plastic tape unless I know for a fact that it can be moved and will be moved accordingly. It's best to provide a nice large zone away from the pup. There is no strict law about how close you can get to a seal on the beach, but the basic guideline is 50 yards. The more the better, frankly. If you're close enough to an animal that you're affecting its behavior, then you're too close. And it's not just the pup that we're worried about, it's the mother. The mother's paying attention to what's going on the beach. So if there's any activity anywhere near where the pup is, the mother is less likely to come up to where the pup is located and solicit it. Hopefully, if the pup is paying attention, it's noticing where the mother is, and it may cry and the mother may appear at the water's edge, and the pup may then go back into the water and join her. But in many cases, the mother will just stay away from the area altogether if there's a lot of activity on the beach. Ideally, it would be great to just be able to close the section of beach off, but that's not practical, unfortunately, in a lot of places. And sometimes one of the best things we can do is just drawing a big circle or a semicircle around the pup to give people an idea that they should stay back. So in the absence of using caution tape, it's always helpful to post some signs and then put a big semicircle in the sand. And you could even write in the sand, please stay back. And that seems to do wonders in a lot of cases I've been involved in. Dealing with people can be challenging. Sometimes people get very upset if you try to tell them that they shouldn't do something. It's helpful to present the information in a non-threatening way where people don't feel like you're talking down to them or making them feel like what they did was bad or wrong and that you're judging them. But giving them information about the animal is always the best approach in my mind. putting the emphasis on the animal and not on the person. And some people will get confrontational. We don't want to have that sort of thing escalate. It's always also helpful to keep a sign out for the mother who might be out in the water. You mentioned you saw the mother in the surf. That's excellent. That means the mother's aware of where the pup is. And that's a huge concern always, that we just don't know if the mother even is aware of where the pup is. So we can always hope that the mother will return if she knows where the pup is. And if we can manage the situation on the beach, we can maximize that happening. Sometimes people feel obligated to remain on the beach to protect the pup, but that can be counterproductive again, because your presence on the beach could be keeping the mother from coming ashore. So ideally, we would post some signs and everybody would leave and the mother would come back to the pup and everything would be fine. But obviously it doesn't always happen. And we do have situations in Lincoln City, for instance, there are some volunteers who call themselves seal sitters, and they will come to the beach with a beach chair and a book, and they'll post themselves not next to the pup, but maybe 100 yards away, in a way that they can monitor what's happening on the beach after posting signs. And they feel good about staying on the beach for hours at a time and doing that. And that's wonderful if they want to spend the time doing that, but we don't necessarily request that you do. It's not a burden that we want to put on people. I think at least putting the information out there that we're aware that the pup is here, please stay away from the pup. It's the law to leave the pup alone. Meeting that standard, I think, is sufficient in many cases, unless it's a very busy beach, in which case we might have to get state parks involved, or in some cases, law enforcement might have to become involved too. I sort of touched on this already. People can become very upset when they see a pup on the beach, and sometimes that can make things more difficult for responding appropriately. We also need to realize that a lot of the pups that are born every year simply don't survive due to one reason or another. Maybe it's a premature birth, or it's a mother that just is not taking good care of the pup for whatever reason. She may have had her own health problems. She may just have lost track of where the pup was. And pups just are born sometimes sick or with a congenital problem that can't be rectified. Unfortunately, a lot of pups each year die. In some scientific studies, it's been estimated that as many as 50% of pups born every year don't survive their first year of life. In some cases, we can euthanize animals that are clearly not going to survive, especially if they're suffering or if they're in a high traffic area where leaving them alone just isn't an option. And maybe there's a traumatic injury that would prevent them from surviving. A lot of people have misconceptions, as I touched on earlier. They think seals need to be in the water. People come to their own conclusions sometimes about what they're seeing. It's always helpful to provide them with factual information to dispel whatever misinformation they may have. And again, we don't want to confront people that are upset. Try to diffuse the situation if at all possible. We don't want to have any physical altercations happening on the beach. If anyone ever feels threatened by somebody on the beach, they should try to leave the situation and feel free to contact Oregon State Police. They have been more than happy to get involved if they need to in these sorts of situations. And I would certainly want to know about it too. These are rare events, but they have happened in some locations in the past. So if you're interested in helping, I gratefully appreciate reports about animals on the beach, finding out where they are, what they are. One of the best ways of doing that is by using a smartphone, taking pictures and texting me in real time. I can get the information and I can give you feedback about what you're seeing. Smartphones have revolutionized stranding response over the last 15 or 20 years. And helping to educate people about what you're seeing on the beach and reducing harassment as it happens. Looks like more questions. Okay, we'll get to that in just a moment. We also have a WhatsApp chat group that I've just set up. So if you're interested in being involved in this, please share your contact information with me. Basically, I need your cell phone number, and you need to have this app on your phone. But basically, this is a wonderful means of communicating within a group of people in real time about things that are happening. So if there's an animal on the beach here in East Harts or in Oceanside, I can let the group know, and then a member of the group on the chat group can say, great, I will go get some signs and post them, and other people in the group can say, wonderful, I'll meet you there, or maybe I'll go there in a couple hours and check on the pup, see if it's doing well or what have you. It's a wonderful means of communication. It's prevents us from having to make multiple phone calls to people up and down a list. So if you're interested in this, I would love to get this started here. And I just want to acknowledge that the Stranding Network involves working with multiple groups and lots of very engaged, wonderful citizen volunteers up and down the coast. Also point out that my funding comes from a grant administered through NOAA Fisheries, of the Prescott Grant Program. And I'm going to answer a question real quick. Do mother seals react to signs or tape? That's a very good question. And that's something I should have mentioned. We want to be careful when we post signs or tape that we don't put them in a way that could make it more difficult for the mother to view where the pup is on the beach. So we don't want to put anything between where the pup is and the water. And we don't want to have something that's flopping in the wind and causing something distracting. By and large, I don't think the signs in and of themselves would cause a problem for the mother, especially if they're off to the side of the pup. And that's generally what I do is I'll post signs, 10 or 20 yards on either side of where the pup is, but not between the pup and the water. So we want to make sure that there's a clean line of sight between the pup and the water where the mother might be. And there's my contact information, and I have business cards here and other information.
Started here for the WhatsApp group. So
Wonderful, thank
your
you.
name and your phone number.
Okay. And I can open up to any more questions if anyone has any.
When Karen found the pup on the beach,